Vacation Bible School time here at Willette. Hope that all of you young people and us old folks would encourage others to come be with us as we try to come and enhance our faith, our knowledge, understand more about His will, that we might one day be able to go and to be with God and live with Him forever. The elders have asked me to preach this subject today that I'm going to talk about, and that is worship. Did you know that this hour, this day of the week, should be the most reverent hour of your life? Do you understand when you come in this assembly that we're coming here for the purpose of worship? Worship comes from a Greek word, proskuno. Proskuno literally means to bow down or to kiss forward. And our worship is always to be directed to God. God is worthy of our worship. I was glad when they said unto me, "Let us go into the house of the Lord." Someone says, wait just a minute now, this is not the house of the Lord, because the Lord doesn't own a house like He did in tabernacle days and temple days. My friends, the emphasis is when God's people come together, if it be in this house, if it be out in a field, if it be in a barn, when God's people come together, we ought to be excited about being together to worship Him. This is something that I think is a trend that has developed in the last 25 years of not putting enough emphasis on our worship to God and doing so in a way that would please God. Psalm 89 verse number 7 says, "God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints, and to be held in reverence by all those around Him." If you notice, it says He is to be reverenced or reverence. The word reverence there means to pay respect to. Now, sometimes folks don't understand. If you go to India, they may be showing reverence or respect to an idol or to a god, or to some political leader. But what this verse says, that God is greatly to be feared. Where? In the assembly of the saints. Where God is to be reverenced is not just in the assembly of the saints, but especially in the assembly of the saints. We ought to reverence Him. Brethren, I don't know if you know or not, but this is a sacred place when God's people come together to worship Him. Now, on Monday morning, we may come in here and work on the lights. Oh, that's not sacred. This is not a sacred building. But when the saints come together for the purpose of worshiping Him, we ought to be reverencing God. We'll talk about that today because I think that it is very important. Why is God worthy of reverence in the assembly? Well, number one, because of who He is. Who is He? He's our Creator. Genesis 1, verse number 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Let us make man in our image. Thus He created male and female in the image of God, in the image of Him. He's sovereign. He is the sovereign God. Psalm 135 verse 6. What's this? Whatsoever the Lord pleased, that did He in heaven and earth and in the sea and all deep places. He's sovereign. He's everywhere. He has all power. He has all authority. He is perfectly holy. Exalt the Lord, that you might worship at His holy hill, for the Lord is holy. You may be here today because your daddy made you come, your mama made you come. You may be here today because you feel like that the elders might come make a visit if you don't come. But I'm going to tell you something, friends. What ought to motivate us to come to worship God is that He is our Creator. He is sovereign. He is our holy, perfectly holy God. He is perfectly righteous. Psalm 145 verse 17 says, "The Lord is righteous in all of His ways and holy in all of His works." Are you getting the idea now that when we come together for the purpose of worship, that it's all about God? It's all about Him. And you know, we need to worship Him because of where He is. He is in our worship. He's present. Somebody said, well, God's everywhere. Well, sure He is. But He is here. Matter of fact, Matthew 26 through 29, He is in communion with us. Do you realize that? When we partake of communion, the Lord's Supper, and some of you may be visiting, you may wonder, maybe first time you ever witnessed that, and you say, that's kind of strange. We don't do that where I go or whatever. I've never seen that done. But we do that every Lord's Day because Jesus instituted that. Matthew 26 through 29. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through the remainder of the chapter. And He says, "For as often as you do this, you do show the Lord's death till He comes again." Well, how often did they do it? The early church. They did it on the first day of the week. How do we know that? Read Acts 20. Verses 6 and 7. Paul stayed there in Troas 7 days where he could take the Lord's Supper with them. He could take the communion. You see, our fellowship, when we take communion, our fellowship is not only horizontal, but it's vertical. That is, that we're fellowshipping each other, but we're in fellowship with God. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 16. He is with us when we sing. Hebrews 2, 11 and 12. In the midst of the church will I sing praises unto God. Brethren, when we take the Lord's Supper, this is a reverent thing. Now, let me say something that I disagree with. I disagree with the idea that the Lord's Supper is the most important part of worship. I've heard some brethren say that. Some will say, well, the main part of our worship is the Lord's Supper. Some people believe that because they come and take the Lord's Supper and then they take off and go fishing. That's not the main. That's just as important as preaching. That's just as important as singing. But you don't find in the Bible where somebody says, yeah, but doesn't it say in 1 Corinthians 11 or Acts 20 verse 7 that they came together for the purpose of taking the Lord? That was an act of worship that was done on the Lord's Day on Sunday, but it's not any more important than anything else. That's the reason that oftentimes when people say, will you give me the Lord's Supper on Sunday? Well, yeah, we can do that if that's what you really want. But the point is, are you emphasizing the Lord's Supper more than singing? Are you emphasizing the Lord's Supper more than giving? Are you emphasizing the Lord's Supper more than preaching? It's important, but it's not any more important than any other act of worship. Now, I want you to notice because of what He has done. He has provided for our physical needs. He's provided for our spiritual needs. In Psalm 145, verses 15 and 16, listen to these words. The eyes of all wait upon Thee, and Thou givest them their meat in due season. Thou openest Thine hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. Who does that? God does that. Did you know that He gives us our daily bread? Do you understand that the God of heaven is worthy of our worship because He provides for our physical needs? And not only that, He provides for our spiritual needs through His Son. Romans 5 and verse number 8, God commended His love toward us while we were yet sinners. Christ died for us. Much more now, being justified by His blood, we shall be saved from wrath through Him. So, God is worthy of our praise. Why? He takes care of our physical needs. He's worthy to be praised, and I don't think I have to go into a lot of detail of why we worship God, because He takes care of our spiritual needs. But I say all of that to look at some suggestions for our worship. I want to give you some suggestions for our worship. Now, those of you that are young parents, I don't know how you do it sometimes. And sometimes you'll come up to me and you'll say, I want to apologize for my son, my daughter. They were just real terrible today, and I don't even know, I didn't know there was a problem. Okay, if I can't out-preach your kid, I don't need to be up here. All right? Don't beat yourself up. But let me just give you some suggestions that will help us in our worship to God. Prepare your mind mentally for worship. Know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Brethren, this is not a ball game. This is not an activity that like every other activity we do throughout the week. We're here for the purpose of assembling to show our homage, our respect, our reverence to God. That's important. Do you understand that? I don't think we ought to have monitors up here and somebody says, okay, you're not singing, hey, you didn't bow your head. Someone told me one time in India, said, while you was praying, they were some people didn't have their head bowed. I said, how'd you know? Listen, worship is on an individual basis. If your worship is going to be acceptable unto God, then your heart must be right. You must have a faith in God and to be His child. And you need to understand that when you come together, that mentally you have to prepare yourself for worship. It's important. Number 2, I would suggest that we keep the restrooms by you and your children to a minimum during the worship period. Now, am I saying that you shouldn't get up and go to the bathroom as I get older? No, I'm not going to tell you that. But I tell you what you ought to do. You ought to give your children and yourself water and a bathroom break before you come in to worship. Keep it at a minimum. Now, somebody's going to get up and say, boy, I hate to do this. I got to go to the restroom, but I know he's talking. I'm talking to all of us. I want to improve my worship too, brethren. We're talking about how I don't want, it's not, I talked about children not being a hindrance to me. They're not. I'm so focused on what I'm going to say, I don't know what you're doing. But other people are watching you. Other people could be a hindrance to them. Number 3, be aware of toddlers to teens, that they are never too young or too old to worship. Remember, attitudes learned while one is youth are carried into adulthood. What you do when you're young, you teach your children when they're real young, they're probably going to carry those same habits into adulthood. Number 4, be rested well. If you text me after 9 o'clock on Saturday night, you won't get me. Because I've got to feel good, and I want to feel good when I come to preach and when I come to worship God. I'm not going to go, and there's nothing wrong if you all want to do that, but I'm not going to do that. As much as I'd love to go to a Tennessee football game on Saturday night and stay out to 2 o'clock in the morning, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. Or if it's a Sounds game or whatever, I'm not going to go to any of them because I don't want to fight all the traffic. But the point is this. When we come into worship, we must physically and mentally be prepared and alert to worship God. And number 5, concentrate on what's going on. Put all other things out of your mind. And you can't do that when you're looking at everybody else behind you and beside you, and when you're turned around in your seat. You need to be up here is where it's at. This is where the worship is taking place. The singing is taking place. The praying is taking place. The Lord's Supper in your mind. You need to concentrate. You might say, well, that's just the way I concentrate. It can be a hindrance and a stumbling block to others. It's important that we worship. We worship from the heart, that we worship and we're focused on what we're doing. God's watching. God knows. Do we not want to improve in every area of our worship? Do we not want to be the best that we can be in our worship? Let me ask you a question. Do you believe there are changing trends in worship today? Somebody says, well, do you have to have a dress coat on? Do you have to have a tie? No, I'm not saying you have to have that. Not at all. And our elders are not, we don't have a dress code where that you have to wear a necktie and you have to have an Amish dress on in order to come to worship. Don't leave, and this is when you're on Facebook and you're on social media, I know what's going to be said. I'm not saying that at all. But brethren, do you believe that we have become very casual as a church as a whole in worship? I have preached in I don't know how many different congregations and meetings and things, and it just blows my mind. Some of that stuff, I don't know how in the world they'd even wear it to a ball game, much less to worship. Can we not teach our children at a young age and mold their minds that when we come into the assembly of God's saints, that we are to reverence Him, we are to respect Him, and that we want to not be a hindrance? We don't want somebody to look at us and say, look what they've got on today. Man, can you believe they're wearing that? I don't think men have to wear ties. I don't think men have to wear tuxedos. But I tell you what we need to do. And I'll tell you this little story that actually happened. There was a preacher that invited one of his members, a deacon, to go with him to the funeral home on Sunday night. They were talking before church, said, I'd love for you to ride down with me. It's about 10 or 15 miles to the funeral home. And said, I need somebody to go in. Would you go with me? And the deacon looked down at himself and said, do I look like I'm dressed to go to a funeral home? He had a big hole in his pants. And he said, well, I'm not dressed. I can't go to the funeral home. I'm not dressed appropriately. Does that make any sense to you? You're going over to see the dead. Jesus is alive, and you're worshiping God, and you think it's all right to come haphazardly, casually, and could care less what anybody else thinks about you. But if you went down to the funeral home to worship, you would say, well, I've got to wear my best. It reminds me of something I read one time. This is in 1999. Some people publicly chastised Martha Stewart for wearing a pink pantsuit to the White House state dinner. She disregarded White House protocol by wearing short pink pants in the evening. Finally, she should have known better. Frankly, she should have known better. Formal clothes are appropriate for special occasions, especially at the White House. Now listen to what Letitia Baldridge, who is was a social secretary during the Kennedy years. She said, I admire Martha Stewart tremendously, but I think she needs to read other people's books on how to dress properly for such an occasion. A state dinner means a long dress to the state dinner. You'd agree or disagree with all that, but my point is this. Have we not changed? Do you not hear these community churches and these places, and they'll say, come as you are? We don't care, just come as you are. Is that a good sign? Is that a good signal? We're coming into the house of the Lord to worship, and we don't care what we've got on? Somebody says, well, we shouldn't come. You can come and have a appropriate dress, and men and women both, but that doesn't mean that's not going to make you right. Well, I agree with that. But I'm just asking you to consider with me, have we not become too casual in our thinking when it comes to worshiping God? I found this. This is a dress code. While visiting, and it's not locally, it's one of our state penitentiary. It says, this is what they had on the board. No tight clothing or body attire, spandex, leotards. Got to be careful how I say that. I know how to say that, but I said something the other day, and someone says, you can't say that. That's not politically correct. So anytime I get close to one of these words, I'm trying to really be careful. Leggings. I think it says yoga pants. Tight clothing. You can't go to a prison wearing that. You can't go in to see somebody. That's on the board. You can't go in and do it. Somebody says, wait just a minute. You don't have the right to tell us how to dress. We can go in the way we want. You tell the warden that. This is the. Do I agree with? Don't have to agree with it or not. That's what the law is. That's the rule. Not only that, women's skirts and dresses. This type of clothing should be below the knee to prevent exposure of the upper leg part. I'm telling you what this sign says going into a prison. And it says the standard measures 2 to 4 inches within the knees. Other appropriate clothing includes non-revealing clothes. Do not expose the shoulders, the chest, and the stomach. Such attires are belly shirts, spaghetti strap tops, halter tops, etc. For men, khaki men's trousers can be appropriate. I don't know why you call it trousers. I always call them breeches where we come from at Monterey. But pants, trousers, they should not be too tight. Jean wear with holes is not proper. Brethren, I honestly can say to you that once you start down that road of wearing that kind of stuff, there's no end to where you will go. Somebody told me one time, said you couldn't preach in Florida where they churches in there, said some of them almost wear bikinis and bathing suits to churches. Well, I've not seen any bikinis and bathing suits, but I tell you what, I've seen a whole lot of stuff pretty close to that, and I'm not even in Florida. It doesn't matter if you live in Florida, Tennessee, or wherever you live. We need to take our worship very, very serious. And the way we dress, the way we act. So I put up here, we need to dress up. Don't dress down to go to church. You don't get to, I understand that you wore your best in days gone by. Well, a lot of people wore overalls to church. There's nothing wrong wearing overalls to church. Make sure they're clean. Wear your best. For some reason, some people will go to the closet, and when they go to the funeral home, they got a dress or clothes for that. And then when they go to a ball game, they got clothes for that. And that's probably appropriate. But when you get over here for church, it seems as though you want to be as slouchy as you can possibly be. You want to be just as casual as you want to be, because somebody's going to say, well, you can't tell me how to worship. You can't tell me what to wear. No, I'm just trying to get us to think out loud together how important it is when people could be distracted by our worship and what we do. Number 2, we need to learn to speak up. Fellas, when you get up here at this microphone, don't be ashamed to speak up. I've heard folks make announcements, have a prayer, and I didn't have I couldn't say amen. I didn't know what to say. God, not only are you praying to God, but you're leading this congregation in prayer, and everyone needs to hear it. Come to the microphone, speak up, stand up. Unless you've got health issues, when the song leader asks people to stand, you ought to be willing to stand. It shows that your involvement. It shows you're engaged in worship. Stand up for the invitation hymn. Stand up when they ask you to stand up. Why? It shows that you care, that you're concerned, that you're engaged in your worship. Now, if you've got arthritis or you've got some kind of health issue, don't say, man, I've got to get up, or I'm going to break a leg because the preacher said you got to stand. No. Just understand, our worship, we need to be the best that we can be in our worship, and we don't want to be a distraction to anyone else. So we're looking, and I put up, sit up. I have preached before when people would literally go to sleep on me. Sit up. If you would go to bed early at night on Saturday night, you'd be ready for worship. You wouldn't be so sleepy. Go home and take you a nap this afternoon, and you'll be ready tonight for worship. Sit up. Be engaged. Don't slump down like you're bored to death and you can't wait till they get. We're talking about worshiping our God, who is blessing us physically, spiritually, who deserves all of our worship. We need to be paying attention. We need to be worshiping God, and we need to listen up. Listen to what's being taught. Listen. And when you're listening and you're engaged in worship, sing as though you mean it. I've laughed through the years about the first time I ever attended a Church of Christ, and they were singing, we're marching to Zion, oh, man, I didn't think it was going to ever get slow, boring. I'm going to tell you something, brethren. Sometimes our worship is just slow. It's as though we put no feeling in our worship. It's as though that we're not engaged in our worship. And when I go to India and those people, I don't know whether they're off tune or not, because I don't know exactly what they're saying, but I can tell you right now, every person in there will sing to the top of their lungs. And I'll tell you one thing is when they take the Lord's Supper, there will actually be tears coming down their face. They're engaged in it. And have we as American churches become so casual and so lackadaisical in our emphasis on worship that we have failed to listen up and then to follow up? Make the adjustments in your life. Make the necessary adjustments. We want our children to know that this hour, today, is a day, the most reverent day of the week. And tonight, I hope you'll come back, for our worship tonight, it is a very reverent time. It's not a time to let your kids run around the whole auditorium. It's not a time to let them running in and out. It's a time to focus upon Jesus, upon the cross, upon our worship, upon how that we love the Lord with our heart, with our soul, and with all thy might. Worship to God. Man, I look forward. If I knew I could never attend another day of worship, I hope I don't embarrass Miss Frances Russell. She had a birthday last week. You know where Miss Frances is at today? She's in worship. She probably don't feel as good as maybe some of us do. She's here. She wants to be here. And she's a little older than most of us. Someone told me the other day that one thing that I really, really miss more than anything else is being able to go to worship. Can you say that? Do you feel that way? Man, worship is a great opportunity. I love to hear good songs, good singing. I love to be able to partake of the Lord's Supper and to engage ourselves and to give God our best. When you go to a ball game, you go to a soccer game, or when your kids are playing and your grandkids are playing t-ball, I know how it is. I've been there before. Man, when our little granddaughter plays ball, she got a hit the other day. I thought it was the best hit of anybody on the team. I don't think he got out of the infield, but she got 2 bases out of it. Man, we were cheering, we were excited. And when we come to worship, it's as although, and I'm not embracing that, I'm embracing the idea of engaging yourself. It coming from the heart. You're excited about being here. You look forward to being here. Nobody's going to make me leave. Nobody's going to run me off because I love the Lord. I love His church. I want to worship Him. I want to give God the praise, the honor, and the glory. He deserves it. And I fail Him sometimes. I don't do exactly like I should sometimes. I catch myself sometimes in the Lord's Supper as I'm almost, we got to hurry. Got to get through it. Got to get through it. It's fast. No, brethren. We ought to be centered our minds on the cross. I've been to places where the Lord's Supper would take 10 to 15 minutes. I have been in worship before in places where that when they sing, they would sing every verse, and then they would even sing the first verse again. I thought, wow, now that could get a man in trouble there. Not with God, it won't. Let our worship come from the heart. Let us be engaged. Let us show people how important it is that what we're doing is worth our energy and our effort and what all we do in our lives in worship to Him. Think about it. Let's improve our worship, and it all starts with me. My worship must come from my heart. If you're not a Christian today, I know this has kind of been an unusual lesson. One that I don't particularly like preaching, I'll be honest with you, but I think it's very needful, and our elders thought it was very needful. Brethren, love God. Love Him with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. Understand the importance of coming with the saints of God and revere Him who is worthy of our worship. But did you know if you're not a Christian, your worship is not acceptable to God? If you're not a Christian, your worship is not acceptable to God. Because God only accepts worship from those that are His children. In other words, I can pray to God, I can sing to God, that's great, that's good. But for my worship to be in spirit and in truth, I must be a child of God. To be a child of God, I must accept the teachings of what God says to do to be a child of His. I must believe the gospel with all of my heart. John 8:24. Unless I believe that He is the Christ, and then I would be lost. I would not be a child of God. And I must repent of my sins, turn away from sin, and confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and be baptized for the forgiveness of those sins. I'm a Christian. I'm a child of God. I'm going to live. I'm going to serve God as I should. Perhaps today, something that I have said has touched your heart. I hope that would be what it would do for all of us. And you would focus and maybe look at your own life and say, you know, maybe he's right. Maybe I've not really given my worship to God like I should. Maybe I've not been engaged. Maybe I have let my mind wander somewhere else. Brethren, we ought to be so focused on God that we don't know what our neighbor's doing when we're worshiping. If you need to come back home, we need to pray with you, for you. Would you come right now while together we stand as we sing?